І, будь ласка, запросіть своїх приятелів теж до середини тут. Ми хочемо скоро починати нашу сесію, то вже не завчасно. Будь ласка, всіх. І ті, що тут, і ті, що в коридорах.
Are they ending the other panels?
Yes, they did. I got to each one of them and said they just got to end. There was only two that were still running. And I got Emil Yereniuk likes to carry on, so. And then Renata is wrapping hers up. They had a very large group of speakers in the event area. So we are at 3:05. Your panel coming down with their own accord?
Audits just went to find them.
Okay.
They're all in meetings with one another. So.
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. Dion just got in. Again, we invite you to take your places, just as quickly and as quietly as you could, please. A couple of housekeeping items before we open the plenary panel session. Woodlaska, we will be finishing here at 4:30 sharp. Your moderator will end the plenary panel promptly at that time. This hall has to be cleared, so please take your artifacts and materials with you. They do need to prepare the hall here for the banquet tonight. The banquet begins with the cocktails and social period from 6:15 to 7, and the banquet will begin promptly at 7 p.m. tonight. For tomorrow's session, we reconvene with an ecumenical prayer service, Malabin, from 8 to 8:30. The continental breakfast will be served from 8:30 to 9, and the plenary session, final plenary session, will begin at 9 a.m. sharp. And the reports and conveners for the various portions of that plenary, you know who you are. Please be prepared to bring your reports and to deal with resolutions. So once again, please take your places. Tonight's program begins at 6:15 with a cocktail hour, and the banquet starts at 7. Tomorrow's program, major plenary, starts at 9.
Okay, so we're good to go?
Okay, I'll introduce you here. Okay, we will now begin the plenary session. The topic is a plenary panel dealing with the topic or theme shoulder to shoulder, Canada's support for Ukraine, humanitarian, security, and political. What's next? We have some eminent representatives from Ukraine and from the Canadian government. I will invite our moderator, Ihor Michalcheshin, to introduce the panel and the discussion.
Good afternoon, delegates. My name is Ihor Michalcheshin. I'm the new Chief Executive Officer at the UCC National Office in Ottawa, but I am from Winnipeg. We are here for a 90-minute session, which promises to be very interesting, entitled Shoulder to Shoulder, Canada's Support for Ukraine, Humanitarian, Security, and Political, What's Next? In his remarks yesterday, Minister Goodale noted that Canada's close support of Ukraine is a non-partisan issue, as successive Canadian governments of different political stripes have continued to show support for Ukraine, its people, independence, and democracy. We are inviting our speakers today to share their thoughts about what has worked, what has not worked, and their insights on the landscape in the geopolitical world and where Canada and the international community should be to bring peace and prosperity to Ukraine. I will briefly announce a short biography of our special guests, but their full biographies are listed on your table. As for this morning's format, similar to this morning's format, we're going to be written questions can be submitted to me, to the chair. There's volunteers in the room, and if you pick your hand up with a card with your paper, they will bring the card to me. You can also just see me at the side table here as well. Our special guest, the Honourable Stéphane Dion, is Canada's Minister of Foreign Affairs and President of the Cabinet Committee on Environment, Climate Change and Energy. I'm just going to introduce everybody. Mr. Vadym Prystaiko is Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister. He has a long and distinguished career in Ukraine's foreign service, including being Ukraine's ambassador to Canada. And Paul Grod is UCC National President, served in that capacity since October 2007, and he's worked as well as Vice President of the Ukrainian World Congress. Just a reminder about the format, if you can please send questions up to me. We're going to let our speakers have a few minutes to present their insights, and then we will proceed with some follow-up remarks and some questions. And the chair has reminded me that we have to be out of this room at 4:30 or as close as possible so that the room can be prepared for tonight's award banquet. And again, feel free to send questions up any time. So I will invite Mr. Dion to come up to the microphone first.
Thank you, Ihor, dear Vadym, dear Paul, mesdames et messieurs, dear friends. Good afternoon, bon après-midi, vitayu. I cannot thank you enough for inviting me to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the Ukrainian immigration to Canada, the 75th anniversary of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and the 25th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. Trois fois merci. This triple anniversary gives us a golden opportunity to take measure of Canada's Ukrainian dimension, because in some ways, Canada is a Ukrainian country. Yes, we are a Ukrainian country of our own kind, not only because there are about 1.3 million Canadians of Ukrainian origin, and not only because Canadians have marveled at the golden wheat fields stretching against a vast blue sky, which surely reminded them of Ukraine and the flag of their country of origin. Yes, we benefit so much from our strong Ukrainian dimension, not only because Ukrainian Canadians have given to Canada as a gift the most universal part of their culture, but also because Ukrainian Canadians have been key in helping Canada to realize one of its fundamental identities, to be a multicultural country. And let me describe it by my own personal experience as a Quebec City kid. My father, Léon Dion, was a professor of political science at Laval University. In the 1960s, he was the senior advisor of the BB Commission, that is, the Commission of Bilingualism and Biculturalism, or the Laurent Danton Commission, the Laurent Danton Commission. Some of you will remember. As you'll recall, the concept at that time was biculturalism. So years after, I asked to my father how the concept of biculturalism became multiculturalism. He explained to me that it was the Canadian Ukrainians, especially from the West, from the prairies, that have been the most convincing advocate of this change. They explained, and especially to my father, as the senior advisor of the Commission, they explained that the concept of a Canada only shaped by British and French, les Anglais et les Français, was not an accurate description of the cultural richness of our country. And so, Pierre Elliott Trudeau developed the policy of official bilingualism and multiculturalism, which eventually became provisions in our Constitution, fundamental principles of our identity, as a gift of the Ukrainian community of Canada. And now, today, as the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau has put at the core of his government the philosophy of multiculturalism. That means the concepts of inclusive growth and strength in diversity. He may count on strong Ukrainian Canadians to support him, like my colleagues Marianne Mihaichuk, Chrystia Freeland, Boris Kyle Peterson, Julia Zerovics, and Ralph Goodale. Ralph Goodale, oh, he's almost Ukrainian, okay? He's Ukrainian. But while Ukrainian Canadians are contributing to the building of Canada, Ukraine itself lives in horror a large part of its recent history. From Holodomor to the suppression of its culture through the long winter of the Soviet regime. When, as a student in the 1970s, I visited Kiev, I knew that I was in Ukraine. But no one told me that I was in Ukraine. I was told that I was in the Soviet Union. At Ukraine's independence 25 years ago, Canada felt that having benefited so much from our vibrant Ukrainian community, we needed to pay back and to help the new free country. When I went back to Ukraine in December of 2013 as a Canadian MP, participating in an observing mission during by-elections, I was impressed to see so many Canadians everywhere proudly offering their skills and talents to Ukraine. And since the unacceptable aggression of Russia against Ukraine, Canadians' determination to support Ukraine only grows stronger. I saw that when I came back last winter as our Minister of Foreign Affairs. I saw Canadians everywhere. A striking example of this Canadian mobilization is this moving initiative across many of our provinces to provide emergency vehicles and expertise to contribute to those affected by the conflict in Ukraine. Ukrainian Canadians and the UCC have shared in collecting donations of $90,000 for an initiative which will cover transportation for 10 ambulances traveling from the cities of Winnipeg, Toronto, Montreal, to be sent to Kiev in this time of need. Today, I am pleased to announce that the Government of Canada will contribute the remaining $40,000 to ensure those ambulances are delivered to Kiev to assist those suffering from the conflict. And as always in Canada, I'm saying that to our Ukrainian visitors, I will repeat in French because it's a good news. Too bad that I cannot repeat also in Ukrainian. But I may say, though, it will be the same number of money. In English or in French. Donc je disais en anglais, cette bonne nouvelle, que pour appuyer l'initiative de la communauté ukrainienne du Canada, nous allons, comme gouvernement, ajouter $40 000 aux $90 000 qui ont été trouvés pour s'assurer que des ambulances se rendent à Kiev de façon à ce qu'on puisse aider les populations dans le besoin affectées par ce conflit terriblement injuste qui est imposé à l'Ukraine. I think it sounds even better in French. During my visit last winter, I asked the Ukrainian authorities, how can Canada do more for their country? What would be their top priority in receiving additional support from Canada? I have been told again and again by everyone I have spoken to that the top priority would be to provide further support for a competent police, a professional police, an honest police service. So when I came back, I said that to Prime Minister Trudeau, and this is why I am here today to announce, on behalf of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the whole government, that Canada will provide $8.1 million in new funding to support the National Police of Ukraine. Et donc, je suis fier d'annoncer, au nom du Premier ministre Justin Trudeau et du gouvernement tout entier, l'octroi d'un nouveau financement de 8,1 millions de dollars pour appuyer la police nationale de l'Ukraine. This includes up to $6.6 million over 3 years in support of a police training assistance project, and will also provide up to $1.5 million toward the Ukraine Police Equipment Project to make Ukraine's national police service more effective. This funding builds on Canada's earlier support, such as the work of Canadian police officers on the ground to support and advise their Ukrainian counterparts. Yes, Canada will be shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, as is the title of today. Our bond is historic, our bond is durable. We will be shoulder to shoulder to support Ukraine in the quest for a secure, stable, and prosperous country that could serve as a model in the region and become in itself the best rebuke to Putin's attempts to determine its future. We are shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine when we convey our views directly to Russia. When Prime Minister Trudeau spoke to President Vladimir Putin, and when I met Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, we clearly signaled Canada's profound disagreement with Russia's unacceptable behavior against Ukraine. We voiced how Russia's actions represented and still represent a clear breach of international law and undermines peace and security in the region. We are shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine when we are taking a leadership role in enhancing NATO's deterrence toward Russia, including through the command of the multinational battalion in Latvia. We are shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine when we insist to all our European allies that we must stick together and remain strong with our sanctions as long as Russia does not respect its Ukrainian neighbor and falls short of full implementation of the Minsk peace agreements. It's true that, as you see, Canada's friendship for Ukraine is not a partisan issue. But I will only say a fact. Since Mr. Trudeau has become Prime Minister, Canada has increased its sanctions against Russia. Canada has increased its support for Ukraine. And Canada has engaged Russia directly about that. I have said to Minister Lavrov that they must do their part towards the full implementation of the Minsk peace agreements. Otherwise, what will happen? We will be in the same position next year, same time, but with more deaths, casualties, and suffering. With our allies, we will redouble our pressure on Putin in order to make him face his responsibilities, especially after the downing of flight MH17. We are shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine through our free trade agreement and our defense cooperation. We have also increased our contribution to the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission and have announced additional peace-building initiatives, including the key issue of demining. As you see, Canada will be, more than ever, among the top donors providing humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable conflict-affected people of Ukraine. Only a few hours ago, on the other side of the planet, in Jerusalem, Prime Minister Trudeau and I met President Poroshenko while we were paying our tributes and saying our farewells to a man of peace. We want peace for the world. We want peace for Eastern Europe, and we want peace for Ukraine. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine with responsible conviction. Steadfast, resolute, as determined peace builder, Canada will be shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, and in doing so, we will strengthen our Ukrainian dimension, this Ukrainian dimension of our own, that belongs to all Canadians, and that has always made us stronger, a great pillar of our past, a guiding light for our future. Thank you, merci, Dziękuję.
right, thank you very much, Mr. Dion. I will now invite Mr. Prystaiko, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Dear Minister, ladies and gentlemen, let me speak in English. I still remember some Ukrainian, for those who don't believe it. And let me start immediately with reference to what you just said about MH17. And specifically, I'd like to quote Minister Dion's statement on 28th of September. In his statement on September 28th, just recently, a couple of days ago, he said, "The conflict in eastern Ukraine, whose greatest impact has been felt by the civilian population, has had tragic implications reaching all corners of the globe." End of quote. As you know, the days before yesterday, the independent joint investigation team made an interim report stating that, let me quote, "A Russian-made Buk missile was fired from rebel-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine, and these findings also show that the launcher used to fire the missile was transported from Russia and returned there following the launch." End of quote. Nothing new to you. I just hope that you would understand me. I'd like to show you a small picture, and I hope the cameras will pick it up. This is a bed, kid's bed, made in Russian Federation in the shape of Buk missile. For additional 80,000 rubles, you can actually build in a rocket. It's not fake. It is a real website. If you're interested in such a piece of furniture, you can buy it on the internet in Russia. That's the enemy we have to face right now. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that sometimes when we talk to our Western colleagues, people with the best intentions, they somehow believe that Russians want the same as all of us. We want peace, we just don't understand how to reach it and what's the best way to get there. Unfortunately, because I'm sometimes traveling to East, I'm travel on many missions to frontline. I just returned from the front lines. I was there last week in Shirokino. I talked to our soldiers. I've seen devastated villages and towns. I accompanied our friends and colleagues, ministers, members of parliament, members of European Parliament, just to show them what the real war is like. And because I have this experience, I won't take much of your time. I hope that we will have some minutes to the answers and questions. But I'd like to tell you what is the real situation is. 2 years were already on the war. And this war is taking not just 20% of our export and import, it's not taking 7% of our territory and almost 8 million of people in occupied territory. It's already took 10,000 people lives. We don't even know how many on the other side of touchline. We know that at least 500 people are missing, 1.7 are in jailed, 29 prisoners, political prisoners, are in Russian jails. We managed to get out just 3 people over 2 years, although we agreed in Minsk that we exchange all for all. 2 words on the Minsk itself. This is, let me be straight, the Minsk agreement is not fair, not at all. We never argued about some island or river or a town or anything, a mountain between 2 nations, no. These people came to our land, snatched it, and we now have to somehow negotiate how to let them leave us at peace. And this is not very good the idea how to resolve it. That's the best we have. And we are so thankful that our partners came to help us and to support, to give a shoulder, and with the help of European Union, United States and Canada, and some of our distant nations like Japan, Australia, who also joined the sanctions, we have managed to stop Putin, to give us, a second to breathe, to rebuild our army, to try to rebuild the economy, which you heard our Vice Prime Ministers describe to all of you today and yesterday, what we managed to achieve in very limited time. But everything will go nowhere if we are not managed to somehow reinforce this peace and somehow reach the agreement which will allow us to live free and start our nation towards what we hope is our home. Lost very, very many years ago. in Western civilizations in Europe. That's all the agreement is all about. It's complicated. I don't want you to read all the very formal and very difficult diplomatic language. The point is, it's allowing us to somehow get out of the conflict, which we started boldly. We managed to stop the Russian army. It's P5, I mean, permanent member of NATO, of UN, which is not allowing us to use the peacekeeping missions, for example, which we're happy to have. The same nation is blocking our OSCE efforts because it is member of OSCE. It is nuclear member, and you remember that we gave up the weapon because the same nation signed the agreement with us in Budapest, promising that it will be protected, and even they won't use the economic pressure on us. Everything was broken, every promise. That's the situation when we found ourselves, and there where we have to start to get out of the situation. We believe that the only road here, because we do not see a line of nations piling up, how to bring the weapons to Ukraine or how to help militarily to fight with the forces which are bigger than many NATO countries. For example, they have many tanks, as many as Britain and Germany together. These are so-called upset miners. They have sophisticated weapons. We lost 18 aircrafts. We have no navy by this time. We lost it all in the war with them. That's the real situation on the ground. That's what we have to face. We are talking about 35,000 people inside our territory, another 45,000 outside. 25,000 in Crimea, and they're preparing to bring the nuclear weapons to Crimea. That is a real hard situation, and the only way, again, let me return to Minsk as the only agreement we have and the agreement we respect. We agreed with nations that as soon as the security situation is resolved, we'll be able to move the political reconciliation. And we'll start somehow to love each other again and be Ukrainians and feel responsibility over these people over the touchline, who by today hate us. I have to admit this. The way is very difficult. We've been trying to do it at least 1.5 years. Now we came to the point, very, very important point, when we withdrew, and you probably read today's news that we withdrew our forces in 3 areas where we hope that it will work and we will be able to extend this practice all over our touchline, and starting from this we will be able to keep this ceasefire. And some psychiatrists believe that when you do not see your enemy through the barrel, at some time you can move to another stage, and finally to political resolution and control of Ukraine over its territory, which is rightfully ours. Sorry, I don't have any sugar to code the message, but that's where we as Ukraine live. Again, I'm very thankful to the Canadian government and to all of you to support our fight. We hope that this is a critical moment, and from now on we will be able to move in much more peaceful way. And by the next time we will see each other, I will tell you how good is everything and how we resolve everything. I just hope this. Thank you for your attention. I will be very happy to have your questions. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite Paul Grod.
Minister Dion, Deputy Minister Vadym Prystaiko, Vice Prime Minister Kirilenko, dear friends, we are here to talk about a very important topic, and that is standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. And I'd like to first start off with thanking Minister Dion for his commitment to Ukraine. Early on in his tenure as minister, he decided that one of his first trips he wanted to take was to Ukraine. And his office, together with ourselves, we met in advance of that meeting. We had an opportunity to brief Minister Dion on our perspective, and Minister Dion invited me to participate in his mission to Ukraine. And I want to thank and recognize Minister Dion and the Government of Canada for their respect for the community and the role that we have to play in furthering and helping Canada be more successful in its foreign policy approach and in helping the situation in Ukraine. we really pride ourselves, Minister, on the fact that we like to consider ourselves honest brokers, in the perspective that we can really help force multiply the work that Canada is doing with the tremendous thousands of volunteers both in Canada and Ukraine that can multiply the work that Canada is doing in Ukraine and showing its leadership there. So I'd like to thank you for recognizing that and for including us in that. I also And Minister, you obviously rubbed off on Prime Minister Trudeau because he took your precedence and took with him to Ukraine a sizable delegation from the Ukrainian Canadian Congress to not only witness and participate in the signing of the free trade agreement, but his expectation is that now we are going to be the ones who are going to be responsible for helping to implement a successful Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement. I think that there's a wonderful opportunity here in this new chapter, the new chapter in the relations between Ukraine and Canada, a continuation of what has been done, but a reassessment or a re-addition of focus, including strong economic support for Ukraine. There's a great opportunity here because I now think that our Foreign Minister and our Prime Minister very much understand the situation in Ukraine, and that is critical for Ukraine today. Having traveled with Prime Minister Trudeau and traveling back with Prime Minister Trudeau, I understood that the Prime Minister fell in love with Ukraine, that Ukraine now has a spot in his heart. And on the trip back, when he was asked by the media, we were there as a delegation, for his assessment of the situation in Ukraine. And he said, I think I have a tough job as the Prime Minister. But when I look at what President Poroshenko and Prime Minister Hrysman are having to do, and the members of Parliament, the ministers, that not only do they have to reform a country that is still struggling with the authoritarian Soviet past, but they're also fighting a war. They're fighting a Russian invasion. And that we really have to look at it from that perspective. We can't push them too hard. We have to support them and help them as much as they can to implement these very difficult reforms. And then he went on to say to the media, he said, the situation is like if the United States invaded Canada and took over a piece of Canada and then shut down the border between Canada and Ukraine to all trade. And now Canada has to find a new trading partner for 80% of its trade. And that is what Ukraine is going through today. So I believe that Prime Minister Trudeau, that Minister Dion understand the situation in Ukraine, and I want to thank you for taking that time. During the Maidan Revolution of Dignity, during this war with Russia, Canada continues to stand by the people of Ukraine. There was, in early days of the Maidan, Canada's Parliament, Canada's government stood shoulder to shoulder with the people on the streets of Ukraine who said no to authoritarian rule. Minister Dion participated at that time as Member of Parliament in numerous debates in Parliament where unanimously, in a non-partisan way, all members of Parliament supported the Ukrainian people both morally and through their actions. Having traveled to Ukraine with the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister at that time on several occasions, Canada continued on a non-partisan way to demonstrate their support for Ukraine. And they advocated for Ukraine. It's not only one thing to actually go to Ukraine and stand with the people and say, we support you, but it's critical, and as we saw how successful Canada is as an honest broker on the international stage, to advocate for Ukraine. And that is something we've been asking for our government of Canada to continue to do that. Canada has been successful in excluding Russia from the G7 discussions, and also in terms of ensuring that sanctions are imposed and calling a spade with the situation in Ukraine. What did we learn? As part of our assessment, looking back and saying, what did we learn and what could we have done better, what could we have done different? I think, first of all, the international community couldn't believe what was happening. In fact, the people of Ukraine couldn't believe what was happening. The Ukrainian people never, ever thought that Russia would ever invade, never mind forcefully and killing thousands of Ukrainians. This is a completely different paradigm. It's a completely different mindset which the Ukrainian people or the international community was never prepared for. And I think we have to learn, we've learned a valuable and a very costly lesson, and it's a lesson that we should not repeat. We should be prepared to engage a belligerent Russia and engage a Russia that is in fact creating havoc in the international security system. Engagement is a way that we should be engaging them in a way that we are countering their aggressiveness in the international community. And that is the engagement policy that I really hope that the Government of Canada and our allies adopt, that recognize that Russia is a danger to international security. The Ukrainian Canadian community took an active role, as I mentioned, during the Maidan in supporting the people's will, and also during this war. We focused on 4 major areas. Number 1 being humanitarian support. Number 2 being the security situation. And Minister, there were people who were sending flak jackets and military headgear to those early soldiers, those early volunteers when there was no army, and giving them things like first aid kits to help them defend themselves. And that was largely led by the people in this room over the last 2 years. And I want to thank you and congratulate you for that effort. And those volunteers have been thanking us and thanking Canada on a regular basis. As I visit Ukraine, I'm constantly met with leaders of these volunteer battalions at that time who've now integrated into the Ukrainian Army, thanking Canada and the Ukrainian Canadian community in particular for its leadership on that front. We've also been engaged on countering the information war with Russia. And we've been countering in a sense that not responding to the propaganda and the disinformation, but essentially creating a message that is a very credible message about what is happening in Ukraine today. And that's why I believe that it's very difficult for Russia to actually spread their disinformation in Canada, because we've set the message correct. The Canadian people understand the situation in Ukraine, and that's why we've taken a very high road approach to engaging on the information war. The reform situation in Ukraine is very critical. We all know that if Ukraine is to be successful and to stop this war, they have to succeed economically and they have to succeed with their reform process. And that is something that we are helping as both volunteers and also encouraging the Canadian government and helping guide the Canadian government on what are some of these technical assistance programs that are going to help Ukraine get over that hill and implement the reforms that are really truly irreversible. And I believe they're, Minister, firmly on their way there. I think it's critical, though, that we assist them and continue to assist them. Right now, Ukraine is at a critical stage, that it's success or failure. And any kind of pullback by Canada or the international community in terms of its technical assistance to Ukraine jeopardizes that reform movement. And Minister, you have a chance to meet Deputy Minister Kirilenko and First Deputy Prime Minister Kubio. You will see that they are the new face of Ukraine. And these people who are reform-minded are giving up a lot in order to help rebuild a country that respects its people. And Canada is a key partner for that. And those technical assistance programs that are put in motion need to be multiplied and need to be seen through to its end. And that's why we're calling on the Canadian government in order not to ensure Ukraine remains a country of focus, and that technical assistance funding continues at the same level, if not increases, in order to ensure the success of these reforms. Because, frankly, Minister, I think that we are only a few short years away from those reform processes really getting implemented, and Canada can really demonstrate from its technical assistance program a true success story in Ukraine, but we need to stick with them. In terms of what we should do next, and this is my concluding point, is what should we do next? And when I say we, I refer to it as a common approach, because the Government of Canada, I have to say, has a very forward-thinking approach to working with civil society and listening to civil society and hearing what we think is really important for Ukraine. And that's why I'm going to share, frankly, what we believe is really important right now to focus on. Number one is we need to call a spade a spade. We need to be able to, we can't allow Russia to obfuscate the truth. And I think Minister Dion and Prime Minister Trudeau continue to call a spade, and we need to ensure that we keep reminding the international community that Russia has invaded Ukraine. Russia is conducting a war in Ukraine. Russia has illegally annexed a part of Ukrainian territory. And until that is resolved, let's not obfuscate the truth. As a community leader, I'm also very, very intrigued with Canada's new policy of responsible conviction when it comes to foreign policy. And I think that there's a real opportunity to really implement that in a number of various areas in Ukraine. Number one, Canada has a strong tradition of peacekeeping, and I like the evolution of the terminology, Minister, to peace building, because I think, quite frankly, Ukraine really needs Canada's peace building efforts in Ukraine. The president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, has called on the international community and the OSCE for a OSCE policing mission to Ukraine. I know many people think that it's far-fetched, that Russia will never let it happen, but I think we have to push the point, Minister. I think if we need, the OSCE mission right now is, quite frankly, is reporting on what is happening, but it's not stopping the bloodshed. And we as the international community need to come up with ways on how we stop that bloodshed. And the president of Ukraine has called on the OSCE, which Canada of course is a member of, to launch a peacekeeping, peace policing mission to Ukraine. We need to continue on our international assistance to ensure the solidification of the reform process. And finally, there's a long laundry list of things that we can do, but the final point I wanted to make is that the international community should not force Ukraine into a corner. And what I mean by that, the international community should not force Ukraine into a corner to accept an agreement that, quite frankly, they don't deserve to take on. The Ukrainian people should not be punished for choosing democracy, for choosing the rule of law, and for choosing human dignity. Minister, I know we're on the same side on this front, so I'll end it there. We can get into a more active discussion, but I do believe that we are on the right path. I do believe that the Government of Canada is going to be a strong partner and a strong advocate for Ukraine, and we look forward to working together with the Government of Canada.
Thank you very much to our speakers. I've received 14 questions, which I will attempt to, some of them are very similar, which is helpful. The guests up here will have handheld microphones. I did want to give them a minute each to respond if there's anything that they wanted to respond to in terms of the remarks that other speakers had provided. Mr. Dion, anything to respond right now, or should we just go right to the questions? Okay.
I think I agree with everything. I'm just saying that why I will intervene now, since I agree with everything.
All right, so the first question, actually there were 3 questions received on the similar topic, so I'm going to merge them into one. This question was sent to us by someone who is a Canadian Forces veteran working with Canadian soldiers for overseas missions, as well as somebody who is a separate person who's a Canadian military officer with combat experience working in eastern Ukraine. The question is regarding the Canadian military training mission in Ukraine. There's some questions about, will the Government of Canada continue to support the tactical and medical training missions of the armed forces of Ukraine after the spring of 2017? I'll let our panelists respond to that.
Yes, indeed, we have to consider the renewal after March 2017. The decision have not been made, so I cannot speak for the government. The only thing I would like to say as a principle is I have said that Canada will be shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. Our aim is one day to not have to support Ukraine militarily. We don't want to do that forever. But as long as it will be needed, we'll do it. What will be the exact way by which we'll do it is something we need to consider in consultation with our Ukrainian friends. But Canada will be there shoulder to shoulder as long as it will be needed.
Any other comments?
If I may just second the minister's words, you know, the interesting fact, the Canadian military trainers who are working with our people in Lviv, in Yavoriv, they found out that they also have to learn something. As a hybrid warfare we are facing, that the First Nation being faced with large-scale hybrid warfare. And we're sharing this experience, and NATO, as you know, Canada is a part of, established the platform, the special platform for hybrid warfare, because nations want to know how to actually fight with hybrid warfare, which Russia is implicating now on Ukraine and might use somewhere else. This is very important, shoulder to shoulder, both sides are important projects.
Great. The second question. Will the Government of Canada ensure that Ukraine remains a country of focus for Canada's International Development Assistance Program, as well as technical assistance funding continuing at the same or greater levels of support? Some of these are very specific questions, but we invite all of our panelists to comment on this as well.
As I said, we did not maintain the support, we increased it. And we are doing it for all the reasons I mentioned. And the main one is that we are, as I said, in some way, a Ukrainian country. So our responsibility toward Ukraine will always be strong. And I would like to add something. It's good for Canada. In working with Ukraine, we learn about ourselves.
Again, if I may second the words of the minister, working as ambassador here, and I'm happy that Andrei is doing it my way, we feel it, that, and we're so happy that Ukraine over the years was the only European nation, and we should be proud here, to be given the support of Canada. Very bad that we still need it, as true, but again, thanks to the government and you all, we've been receiving this assistance, and I believe that you can see the results right now in Ukraine. It's not just Ukraine full of Canadians on the different programs, but it's really making the difference. Thank you.
It was interesting, we had a panel earlier today where Ambassador Roman Verstruk, Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, was commenting about technical assistance. And he made an interesting comment about the fact that Canada's technical assistance is significant, but may not be the largest of all the countries. But he says it's very critically important because it's strategic, where Canada has able to respond quicker, identify projects, start with the seed money, and then the other larger donors follow behind in order to, again, force multiply. But he's demonstrated, and I've heard this as well from Ukrainian officials, that our technical assistance is quicker to respond and very, very effective, and helps guide the rest of international technical assistance.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to merge 4 questions into one, so bear with me here. There's a number of questions here about Canada and Russia's relationship. There's a number of questions about how Canada should or can or will engage with the Russian Federation, whether it's in Arctic environments or on the Ukraine file specifically. And the discussion I'd like to have with our panelists is how does Canada approach the Russian Federation? Can Canada be more aggressive in dealing with Russia in naming the specific files and concerns that have been raised here and in other places? How does Canadian engagement with Russia help Ukraine's security? And this is a broad topic. There's a number of questions in there, so I will throw it to all our panelists to provide their comments.
I guess it's for me. We need to be very frank and direct with the Putin regime. We cannot do that if we are alone to not speak to them. I would call that to cut out the links with Putin. I would call that a feel-good bad policy. And it was not rational to do so. President Prystaiko speaks to President Putin. I'm sure he's not pleased to speak to President Putin, but he thinks it is his duty to do so. The NATO official policy is deterrence and dialogue. Everybody is doing that except Canada before Mr. Trudeau. And then Canada was less relevant. If you don't have any intelligence about what is happening in the Kremlin, you're less invited at the table when we have to discuss about Ukraine. Countries that are giving much less to Ukraine are more invited when the allies try to organize their coalition than was Canada. And now Canada is much more invited because they understand that we want to be effective, not only to have a feel-good policy that is a bad policy. So yes, we need to directly engage Russia, as difficult it may be. Now, about the Arctic, we have a responsibility for the world. This is the barometer of our planet. If the Arctic is poorly managed, it will not affect only the people there. It will affect all mankind. There is no rationale to prevent our scientists to work with Russian scientists. If you politicize everything at a point where you're hurting our ability to be a good stewardship of the Arctic, I say it's irrational. It's not good. It's not good for Ukrainians. It's not good for Canadians. It's not good for Russians. It's not good for the world. So Canada will have a rational policy in order to be more effective in our relationship with our friends as our relationship with the regimes we dislike. The only way to be effective on this planet is to act with responsible conviction of this kind.
Any other commentary? Great. Okay. The next question is about Canada and supplying Ukraine with defensive weapons. The question is, what steps can be taken on the Canadian side and the Ukrainian side to move towards an agreement where Ukraine is able to benefit from Canadian defensive weapons, which would be used in potential conflicts now and into the future?
Minister offered me to start. I'm diplomat by profession. I was trying to be diplomatic, although I represent the wartime diplomacy. Sorry, I'm not performing well as a diplomat. I have to tell you that as every nation on this planet, and it's written in the Charter of UN, we have a right to protect, defend ourselves. And this is right we want to implement. It's very difficult to do it when we are in shape as we are now. Over the years, the security services, defense were infiltrated by Russians. Even the Minister of Defense was Russian national. The chief of security was Russian. The military complex was run by Russians. We have many things we have to be able to defend ourselves. And this is a very difficult point when we have to talk to our partners, especially those ones as close as Canada. These conversations are not easy, but we have to be able, somehow to bring the signal, and we're trying it from Ukraine. And all the arguments that if Ukraine is given 10 tanks, the Russia will give 1,000 tanks. Unfortunately, this is very rational. We can buy it because they are providing tanks right now. And that's what makes us feel very uneasy. We do not believe that as soon as we given something, the Russians will escalate, because they can escalate tomorrow, and we will not be happy to defend ourselves. We believe that at some point we might have to the situation when the partners will understand that Ukraine is a reliable partner and matured enough to understand and to take the responsibility of the next step and defend ourselves, whether it will bring us to peace or death. Sorry, I'm saying this way. It's very difficult to find the just words for this sort of argument, and it's very difficult to find the point. The only thing is we don't want to wait too long for this moment because it could be too late for us.
If I could just comment in terms of defensive military equipment, there is a common misconception, often in international policy circles, that Ukraine will never win an escalation game, and if we provide Ukraine with defensive military equipment, then Russia will just escalate and provide more technology to the army that's in the east. I think that's a flawed philosophy from the perspective that at some point we've reached the maximum escalation that Russia can do without declaring a full-scale invasion and war with Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin and his regime continue to obfuscate and deny the fact that this is their war against Ukraine, because they know that that would be highly unpopular for Russian soldiers to be dying in Ukraine, and that's why he's made it illegal for reporters and journalists to uncover the fact that there are deaths happening in Ukraine, and so that's not going to happen. So and that'll be a completely different world if that does happen. What we really need to do is provide the Ukrainians with the ability to defend themselves. And every day, weekly, there are Ukrainian soldiers that are dying from artillery attacks, from long-range artillery attacks, shorter-range artillery attacks, and we need to stop those deaths. And the only way that Putin will understand that he cannot continue to destabilize Ukraine is if they have the defensive military equipment in order to defend themselves.
Up to now, I was in a situation to say I agree with everything, but now I would have just a word of caution. In international politics, when we say it cannot be worse, most of the time we are wrong. It may be worse. So it's why we are very cautious about that. And if we were going there, Canada would not go alone. It would be a decision with our American friends and with the others. I think you will understand why.
And if I just may, this time I'm completely eager to completely confirm with what you're saying, and again, second you, I just want us to escape the misunderstanding. Canada was providing and is providing the military equipment to Ukraine. When we, again, misconception, when we're talking, the things we're talking now is so-called lethal or kinetic. So we've been given a lot. I was actually lucky enough to get back home as ambassador on the Canadian military aircraft, full of equipment. So this assistance is provided. We are talking right now about kinetic, so we're talking about real weapons. And I'm thankful for everything being done. The only thing we're just arguing, very tiny, principled moment. This the weapons, ability to defend ourselves. We are not bloodthirsty. We are on our own land. We are not stepping over any border. We are on our land, and we believe we have the right to defend ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, if anybody has any additional questions, I would welcome them. The volunteers can come and pick them up, or you can drop them off for me here. The next question is in regards to support for a Magnitsky law in Canada. Would the panelists comment on their perspectives on support of a Magnitsky law being introduced in Canada?
Thank you very much. When I was in the opposition, I always asked to myself, why the Conservatives are not doing a Magnitsky law? We were asking for it, and they were doing nothing. Now that I am in the government, I will give you the answer. is because these individuals are already banned in Canada with the existing laws. That there is no sign that they have any asset in Canada. Russian oligarchs are very careful. These guys are very unlikely to have assets in Canada. So if we do a Magnitsky Law, the only result of it will be to put Canadians in danger of retaliation, because being Putin, he will retaliate, and he's a cruel man. He's able to do so. So what we suggest to do is to look at our laws and to see if we may improve it. The Foreign Affairs Committee in the House has to review CIMA, the Special Economic Measures Act. And through that, let's see what we may do that will be really helpful for Canada in order to have more human rights respected in the world. That's the approach we suggest to do. No other countries have done a Magnitsky Law, not Ukraine, except in the United States, but other countries didn't. But countries are trying to improve their sanctions measures, and it's what Canada will do, it seems to me, in a way that will be very effective to protect Canadians and our allies around the world.
I think what's happened is we've really politicized this, and one of the things that we're always very cautious about is issues that are of such importance to not only the Ukrainian community, but other Central and Eastern European communities that have been really behind this Magnitsky Act advocacy. And I think it's really important that we build consensus on these issues that I quite frankly think that there is common views on. And that's why I'm pleased to hear, I think I'm interpreting this correctly, Minister, that you are open to reviewing CIMA and looking at how we could be more effective, because we shouldn't be afraid of retaliation. I mean, Canada put some people on the sanction list, Russia put some people on the sanction list. And quite frankly, being on the sanction list myself, Minister, I'm the envy of most people in this room. So, so I think what's important is that we can have an open dialogue and not politicize this. And Minister, we're prepared to work with you and the government in order to make sure that we can find these nonpartisan resolutions to issues. And as long as we understand each other that we need to send a strong message to Russia that their belligerence, that their war in Ukraine will not go unpunished, I think we'll all be on the same side there.
If I just may add a word. Yes, Minister is right, we don't have Magnitsky Law. It's a bit simpler in our case. We have all the laws we against Russians, and they're much more straightforward than any Magnitsky Law can be. But we are much more sophisticated as well. We are not just fighting on the East, we are fighting in international courts. We are fighting in the High Court of London, we are fighting for the 4 conventions, financial of the terrorism, the how they call it in English, the high seas as well, the investment cooperation agreement between Ukraine, and all the things we're signing all the agreements with Russian Federation. So we are in the courts, we are going through the legal procedures, we are taking the best out of best legal experts from all over the world. We are exploring all the ways, not just asking for the weapons, begging for the weapons to kill somebody, no. We are sophisticated enough to go and use all the means possible, legal included.
Excellent, thank you. I've got 2 very specific questions, and then we'll try to merge some of the questions that are on themes. First, I'm going to ask both the questions, and then they're on different topics. This is for Ukraine, but it's perhaps something that Mr. Grod could comment on. Will Ukraine consider offering dual citizenship to its citizens and citizens of other countries? And the second question is to Minister Dion. The government of Canada stopped providing real-time satellite radar-sat imagery to Ukraine. Could you comment on why that decision was made?
On dual citizenship, I've been replying on this question for quite a long time, even before war. And not many people believed us when we were telling that this is creating the risk for Ukraine. Most of the people in Crimea, they did have both passports, Russian and Ukrainians. And when they voted, they were using our passports, voting for the annexation and the creation of the Russian new entity, federal entity. When they were asked, they were becoming the citizens of Russia at the same time, using this as a legal tool. So we understand what you ask each and every time. We just see it a bit further. We understand that it's creating another risk now when we already lost it. Crimea is in the hands of enemy. We understand that the less and less reasons not to introduce it. We are considering the ideas just a bit premature right now to talk about double citizenship. Thank you.
And why is it premature?
In our law, by the way, that somebody who has Ukrainian and, for example, Canadian passport is considered as Ukrainian in relations to Ukraine. We are not prohibiting the Ukrainian citizens to have other passport. We're just not asking if you are a citizen of some other states. And this, by the way, the more or less international standard for double citizenship. Because people believe that when you have a couple of citizenships, it's created a situation when you can find yourself with no particular country, nation state behind you.
Just want to say that our government is, we understand the situation is different, but in Canada, the Trudeau government were adamantly willing to protect the rights of Canadians to have dual citizenship and to be considered as full Canadian when you have dual citizenship. It's always a difficulty though around the world. If you are in trouble, and let's say you're Iranian and Canadian, the government of Iran does not recognize dual citizenship and will consider yourself only as someone of Iran. And it's the same in China, it's the same in maybe most countries of the world. So if you have dual citizenship and you are abroad, sometimes, not with Ukraine obviously, but with some difficult countries regarding human rights, you need to be careful. They may not recognize your Canadian citizenship. It's something we hope to change in the world, but it's a difficulty that we have. About the kind of help, sensitive help we give to Ukraine, I don't want to comment too much for obvious reasons. When we decide to give a support to Ukraine, it must be very clear that we are 100% sure there is no risk that this technology will go in the hands of the Russians or the separatists. That's the answer I would say about the question you asked to me. The only problem is never to support Ukraine. It's always to be sure you don't support their enemies in doing so.
Great, thank you. Now, there's a number of questions on the topic of sanctions, which I again will attempt to merge into some themes here. So there's concern in this room, in the community, about sanctions and potentially gaps in terms of individuals or companies, or the ability for individuals or companies to do business with Russian companies close to President Putin. There's people who may be in Canada with assets who some feel should be on the list and may have in previous versions of the list been potentially considered in terms of their criteria. So there's a number of questions about the sanctions list that Canada keeps and about the sanctions that the international community has placed on Russia. And so I wanted to ask our guests to comment both specifically on how we can address the specific gaps or concerns in terms of the sanctions on individuals or companies, I think more specifically in Canada, and then the larger issue of the effectiveness of sanctions globally as well. That's for
on the sanctions, the view of our government, once again, is that the sanctions to be effective must be collective. If Canada comes alone, it will be barely noticed in Russia, but it may be detrimental to Canada. So what we are doing is to convince our friends and allies to increase the sanctions and to do it collectively. On the specific case, you may see differences, that some individuals or entities may be listed in the United States and not in Canada, and the opposite, and with Europe, because we have different understanding of the situation. But roughly speaking now, it's quite equivalent among our allies and ourselves. We have had 19 entities since we are the government, and we are always ready to revisit it as much as possible according to the two criteria I mentioned. The first one I already mentioned, it is they must be collective, and the second one, they must be crystal clear. No gray area, whether it's sanctioned, whether it's not. But gray areas are always confusing for the business and for the individuals, and we must avoid that. So these are the 2 points that we'll always be very careful about: collective and crystal clear.
One thing, we look at sanctions and sanctions policy, they seem to be constantly at risk. And we see from many of our European friends, they are pushing and sort of being dragged along reluctantly. And there is a concern that when the sanctions are up for renewal again in January, that they may not in fact be renewed. Minister, perhaps you can comment on it. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on, in meeting with your counterparts in the EU. What is their reluctance? What do you think? Are they going to continue staying the course and standing by Ukraine, or is there some concern that they're going to be waffling on sanctions?
The answer is that yes, there are concerns, and it's why we insist. We would not insist so much if we were sure that our European friends would stay on board. But as long as we were not speaking to the Russians, they were not really taking us seriously. Now that we speak to Russia, that we are fully involved in the strategy of deterrence and dialogue, I hope we'll have more influence on some of our European friends who may have cold feet over time and saying enough is enough, we need to stop these sanctions. I'm confident that for next January, we'll be able to have a renewal, and will neglect nothing to be sure that it will be the case. It's not only the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, by the way. You know, Chrystia Freeland, she will never miss an opportunity when she's advocating for CETA to advocate as well for Ukraine.
Just short remark. I was in the room with Minister Lavrov and Minister Steinmeier, the German minister, who told Lavrov right in the face that, and Sergei, if we can't do this, we will lift the sanctions. And Lavrov told him, sanctions, you introduce them, you take them if you like, we don't care. He was bragging, for sure, because his currency is losing even more than Ukrainian, but we're at war, they're officially not. But what I'm trying to bring here, that just talking to them, it doesn't mean they understand. And as my ministers say, if sanctions are not working, maybe instead of lifting them, you should increase them, so they will work.
It's what we did.
All right, so I have a lot of questions. I'm still welcoming some questions. There's a lot of similar themes, which, again, we're going to talk about here. There's a number of questions in the room about the Minsk Accord, the Minsk agreements, and the strategy that Ukraine and Canada have in regards to the territorial integrity of Ukraine as it relates to Crimea and as it relates to other parts of Ukraine. Second part of the question, which has been asked by folks in the room, is about strategic approach. Does the United Nations, does NATO, are these other venues where Canada and or Ukraine can engage in the continuing efforts to bring peace and stability to Ukraine?
On the Minsk process, I think I will let the Deputy Minister explain the situation, because he's much closer than me about all the details. But what Canada is pressuring Russia to do is to make sure that we have a ceasefire that is a real ceasefire. Because when a ceasefire does not exist, there is no process possible. And we support our European friends, especially Germany and France, who are speaking to the Russians almost daily to be sure that a ceasefire may work. There is a very recent agreement that has been concluded. Hopefully it will be the right one, but I think, Deputy Minister, you should answer on this one.
Thank you very much. Frankly, I don't want to bother you, bore you with all the details of Minsk. It's boring for ourselves. I was in the room when the leaders were talking for 16 hours in a row. 16 hours. I was negotiating first in Minsk, in Berlin, then I moved to Minsk to prepare for the leaders. We wasted 2 days talking to Russians, but then Putin made them to be in one room and discuss the bloody Minsk agreement for 16 next hours. I have never seen that leaders would be, people would be able to sit in one room and discuss the same very short document for 16 hours. I understood what he was doing to do, and everybody would. But to be on the point, as Angela Merkel was doing, and going against what Russians and Putin himself was trying to do, was remarkable. I have to tell you, it doesn't mean, though, that we have the best agreement what we could have. And again, I have to repeat myself. I don't believe that this agreement is fair. I could be fired for these words, but the only word is used for foreign affairs now in our parliament is traitors, just because we have to negotiate it. And the first thing is this in this document is ceasefire. If we have it, we can start moving another step by step, withdrawal, disarming of the illegal formations, withdrawal of this illegal formation, and so on and so forth, long process. At the end of this, it will be the control of Ukraine over its own territories. I have just to mention one very important thing which many people seems to forget. In the Minsk regional, in September of previous year, we agreed that OSCE, which is Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, strange enough, Canada is the member of this organization. It was agreed that this organization will create the security corridor along Russian-Ukrainian border, which is not under our control, through which they are smuggling all the things they want to do. I was always bringing this example. Imagine, we have now been providing fuel to this territory over 2 years, but tanks are still running. So the Russians are performing great logistic operations, providing not just armors, but the simple things like fuel, all these 2 years. And each and every day they would tell them, no, we're not there, we're not fighting there, we're not officially there. So the very difficult process, but now, as I told you before and reported to you before, we are moving in this very difficult direction. It's very difficult to Ukrainians to swallow the pride and go and probably lose something, and I believe, unfortunately, we will lose something in the process, but to find the compromise. Painful, necessary. One word on Crimea. We are very much preoccupied with Crimean Tatars, with this tiny nation which they exiled after the Second World War. They found themselves in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Only half of them survived this ordeal. Now, as soon as they returned and resettled, same thing happened to them. They consider this invasion as a new Stalin's regime, just different guy, the short guy, dictator, just different one. So they consider to find themselves in the same situation. This strategy is going. Some people still remember this exile which they went through all this 70 or 80 years ago. We very thankful for Canada to support this all the sanctions, because again, sanctions are actually two parts. One is for Crimea, and I don't believe they should be lifted before the Russians will free the Crimea. And another part of the sanctions is because of the Minsk process and everything. So the two different parts. We have to be adamant on the Crimea things, and we have to tell Russians that we are not actually going to lift anything until they get out of our territory. And frankly, me personally, I still don't find reconciliation even with myself. So I don't understand how we will lift the sanctions if Minsk is successful, having destroyed the half of our territory and at least 10,000 dead bodies. How can we claim, okay, Minsk is finalized, let's lift the sanctions and get back to business as usual. This is a very difficult decision we will, as a nation, will have to face later on.
Okay, while we were on the topic of Russian relations with Canada and Ukraine, there's a number of specific subjects that have been raised, but I'll put them together in the theme again. So the questions are, will Canada take a strong direction in terms of blocking SWIFT transactions, which is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, international banking system? So will Canada be taking any action in the SWIFT transaction system in terms of financial transactions? In terms of the Russian involvement in Syria, which is a daily reality of our news that we're seeing, and the many questions about Russia's role, will Canada be reacting to Russia vis-a-vis its involvement in Syria? And a related question on the topic of refugees, will Canada and Ukraine be working together to accept potential refugees similar to how other countries have been discussed?
The situation in Syria is awful. The behavior of Russia and Assad is completely unacceptable regarding international law. We are shoulder to shoulder with our American friends and the other members of the coalition to be sure that we'll do everything possible to reach the populations in need in Syria. That's a shame what is happening there. The other question was about
SWIFT, international banking transactions?
Yes, yeah. I may only repeat what I have said. Sanctions done only by Canada will affect Canada, but will barely be noticed in Russia. So the extension of sanctions is something we need to look at collectively. And the third one was?
About refugees.
Refugees.
Canada and Ukrainian refugees.
Well, it's something we need to work with the government of Ukraine. It's something that my colleague John McCallum would be better than me to answer. It's an immigration policy, but we'll not do it without strong cooperation with the government of Ukraine. You understand that whatever number of refugees we would bring in Canada, it will not solve the root of the problem, which is peace in Ukraine, allowing Ukrainians to stay in their country.
If I may comment on the SWIFT. SWIFT can be easily compared to nuclear strike within the sanctions. So this will be extremely serious strike. This system will probably collapse the whole Russian economy. So the nations are very careful, we understand. I just want to bring you some piece of history. When in 1991, the President Bush Sr. came to Ukraine, he came with bright idea. In his statement, he asked us not to destroy Soviet Union, but be a part of it with Russia. This speech was called and famous in Ukraine as the Kiev chicken speech, because the only thing he knew about Kiev or Ukraine at the time, the Kiev chicken, which he mentioned in his speech. Ukrainians just hated him for this. But why I'm bringing it? Because the nations are very careful not to destroy Russians, not to let gangs with nuclear weapons and everything run around this vast territory of Siberia. It's very difficult for us as the nation at war to understand these concerns, because we actually on the verge of running without nuclear because we gave up them. But that's a really difficult situation. We understand when our partners are very carefully considering the SWIFT option. On the refugees, we had 1.8 million people. We managed, we call them internally displaced, IDPs. We managed to absorb them in Ukraine. We are not adding up the problems to the European unions, which are suffering through this enormous influx of the immigrants. 1 million. Imagine if 2 million Ukrainians would come on their steps. We managed. Some told me that Kiev itself managed to absorb almost 1 million people. It's not easy, I have to tell you. We are not as wealthy as Germany and everything. We are suffering much more, but still we managed to keep them inside, and we managed to provide them with housing. So how this works. What I want to raise though, and sorry it's not diplomatic again, this is a great nation where so many of you found your new home. And this is a nation which has the higher visa barrier to Ukrainians. It used to be 39%, now it came down to 30%, and we're very thankful to the new government. But if you compare to European Union, 3%, 2.5%, I don't believe that all Ukrainians will swim over the ocean to, to find refuge here in Canada. They would rather, if they want to escape, they would rather escape in European Union, which is still keeping 2%, 3% maximum, but 30%. Minister, and I will meet Minister of Immigration. It's not a question to you. I'm coming back to Ottawa. I will talk about it. I believe that having the biggest diaspora in the world, we can understand that Ukrainians were actually big backbone of this nation. And even if somebody comes, and I believe that they will add knowledge, expertise, and these people are needed. But as I always mention to our colleagues around the world, we need these people back home. If we want to rebuild our nation, we want these people back. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's just approaching 4:30, so we're going to have time for one more question, and then unfortunately our panel will be over. So, дуже дякую за всі запитання. The last question is a combination of different questions that have been asked here on the podium. What is the best way for Canada and Ukrainian Canadian community in Canada, individually or collectively, to contribute to making the Canada-Ukraine relationship stronger and assisting in reform processes in Ukraine?
Determination, conviction, and openness. Openness because the Ukrainians know more than us what are their needs. So when they told me priority police, we listened and we delivered. So it's why we had the bilateral just before, Vadym and me. That's key. This dialogue between friends should be, we listen, they explain, and we provide. And in providing, we learn.
Just one word from me before we come to Paul, who will definitely say what the Ukrainian community should do. I believe just this word is unity. That's what you are showing. You know that. You know from the history of Ukraine. Where we are not united, we're weak. Now when we are getting there, when we are united, we can do many, many things. Unity is the key word here, I believe. Thank you.
And I think the question is also for all of us in this room. As I said in my speech, we are fortunate enough to have Ukrainian Canadians that are giving us a lot of understanding. And Boris is with us today. So that's key. Our relationship with Paul, when I brought Paul with me, when the Prime Minister speak with him, and with you through him, that's key. The asset that we have is 1.3 million of Canadians that have roots in Ukraine.
And that partnership is key in terms of, as I mentioned before, multiplying the effectiveness of technical assistance. But what's really critical is over the next few years, as Ukraine is starting to implement these irreversible reforms, that technical assistance stays in place and is strong and is increased, because there's still lots of work to do. There's lots of progress that's been made. I believe that in the last 2.5 years, there's been more progress and more reforms done in Ukraine than over the last 25 years. And there is a government to work with. And I'm very pleased that senior members of the government are with us here today. And we've seen that they are united. We've seen the Ukraine and the Ukrainian government that is united. They are moving the agenda forward. There are reforms being put into place. We all want them to happen faster, but we all have to be involved in that process. And this is my call to all of you, is that we can't let our hands down. We have to roll up our sleeves, and each and every one of us think to ourselves, how can we help Ukraine? There are great examples and shining lights, like Natalia Schuster, who is a police officer with the Montreal Police, who spent the last year in Ukraine working virtually as a deputy minister. She couldn't be a deputy minister because she is not a Ukrainian citizen, but she essentially was the right arm in the national police force. And those are the kinds of people, unfortunately, there's still too few of those. And that's why we need to call upon our massive community to think about how they can go there and make serious reforms. There are reforms being made by our various organizations on various areas, whether it's children's reforms, and lots of work being done by the Ukraine Appeal. But again, it's an opportunity for all of us to work together with the technical assistance funding that's being brought by the Canadian government in order to maximize the reform process in Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mizakin Chayim Nasir Panal, thank you to our guests, distinguished guests, for participating. They will be at tonight's banquet, where I'm sure you will be able to ask them additional follow-up questions individually, or specifically, if you like, to have conversation with them about these important themes. And I will turn the chair over to Gerald.
Thank you, Ihor. Let's have a round of applause for a truly concrete, shoulder-to-shoulder discussion for our panelists and for all the healthy comments. Thank you. Yes, any resolutions must be in by 5 o'clock. So if you haven't penned them, write them out. And please take all your belongings with you. This room is being remade for the banquet tonight at 7 o'clock. Cocktails at 6:15.